Nobody talks about the 13-year-old girl on a breeding farm, forced to bear as many children as possible, only to have them ripped away and sent down south to endure a lifetime of hardship without a mother. Slave owners often bred their slaves to produce more workers. The function of such breeding farms was to produce as many slaves as possible for the sale and distribution throughout the South. In this video, we discuss the sad truth about American slave breeding farms. By the 1820s, planters and would-be planters were moving in large numbers to places previously unavailable for settlement, and growing the fiber for sale in Europe and New England, where a textile industry was beginning to thrive. The extension of the so-called Cotton Kingdom required new laborers. As of 1808, when Congress ended the nation's participation in the international slave trade, planters could no longer import additional slaves from Africa or the West Indies. The only practical way of increasing the number of slave laborers was through new births. With so much at stake, black women's reproductive role became politically, as well as economically, decisive. If enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to take the place of aged and dying workers, the South could not continue as a slave society. From many trusted history sources, it's made to appear that America had little choice but to increase slave production to offset the altruistic end of the international slave trade, which Congress banned in 1808. Thomas Jefferson was president at the time. He had no problem with slavery. He literally loved his slaves, failing to free even Sally Hemings, who bore him 6 children, 4 of whom lived to be adults. Jefferson was a Virginia farmer, knowing full well the value of slavery to the Southern economy. Congress at that time was controlled by the party he created, the Democratic-Republican Party. They didn't end the international slave trade to harm slavery, but to preserve it, domestic slavery, in particular. Congress wanted to decrease the external supply to keep prices up for the homebred slaves. Americans did not take up breeding slaves in response to congressional action. That action was taken at the behest of slave breeders as a protectionist means to keep the price of their product up. Jefferson's home state Virginia was the leading producer of slaves. Slavery eventually exceeded tobacco as their leading export. Maryland was second in slave production, followed by several other states. Economist Richard Such did a study which found that in 1860, on farms with at least one female slave, the ratio of women to men was 2 to 1. In Virginia, female slaves exceeded males by over 300,000. They were used to breed. Robert Lumpkin ran what is mostly referred to as a slave jail, with little recognition that he ran the nation's largest breeding farm. He personally had 5 children with a slave Mary, who he ultimately remembered in his will. While owners of the breeding farms and plantations, in general, fornicated at will with their property, they also utilized selective breeding, maintaining their own large bucks and importing large male slaves for the purpose of breeding good workers for the fields. Black female slaves were some of the first people in the country to receive free health care. Breeders took a great interest in fertility and expected multiple births from the women, or their value would be diminished. Home medical journals were produced to help with difficult births that had previously been left to the slaves to deal with. Many films have depicted boats arriving in New Orleans, which became the largest slave market in the antebellum South. Rarely is it shown those ships originated in Richmond and Baltimore. Slaves were also shipped by railroad, packed in boxcars, or sent by stagecoach. The slave breeding farms are mostly left out of the history books except for those that deny their existence. Many of the white slave owners felt they were doing their female slaves a favor when they mated with them, granting them a respite from the brutish black slaves they would otherwise be subjected to. Generally speaking, it was the house slaves that got raped the most. Some mothers had to protect their offspring from the master's wife if she had reason to believe her spouse was the father. States such as Virginia produced slaves as their main domestic crop. The price of slaves was anchored by industry in other states that consumed slaves in the production of rice and sugar, and constant territorial expansion. As long as the slave power continued to grow, breeders could literally bank on future demand and increasing prices. That made slaves not just a commodity, but the closest thing to money that white breeders had. It's hard to quantify just how valuable people were as commodities, but the sublets try to convey it. By a conservative estimate, in 1860 the total value of American slaves was $4 billion, far more than the gold and silver then circulating nationally. Slaves were worth more than everything else they could imagine combined. Because slaves were property, Southern slave owners could mortgage them to banks, and then the banks could package the mortgages into bonds and sell the bonds to anyone anywhere in the world, even where slavery was illegal. In the 1830s, powerful Southern slave owners wanted to import capital into their states so they could buy more slaves. They came up with a new, two-part idea: mortgaging slaves, and then turning the mortgages into bonds that could be marketed all over the world. First, American planters organized new banks, usually in new states like Mississippi and Louisiana. Drawing up lists of slaves for collateral, the planters then mortgaged them to the banks they had created, enabling themselves to buy additional slaves to expand cotton production. To provide capital for those loans, the banks sold bonds to investors from around the globe: London, New York, Amsterdam, Paris. The bond buyers, many of whom lived in countries where slavery was illegal, didn't own individual slaves. Bonds backed by their value. Planters' mortgage payments paid the interest and the principal on these bond payments. As historian Edward Baptist reveals, slavery and its expansion were central to the evolution and modernization of the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, catapulting the US into a modern, industrial, and capitalist economy. In the span of a single lifetime, the South grew from a narrow coastal strip of worn-out tobacco plantations to a subcontinental cotton empire. By 1861 it had 5 times as many slaves as it had during the Revolution, and was producing 2 billion pounds of cotton a year. It was through slavery and slavery alone that the United States achieved a virtual monopoly on the production of cotton, the key raw material of the Industrial Revolution, and was transformed into a global power rivaled only by England. Several factors coalesced to make the breeding of slaves a common practice by the end of the 18th century, chief among them the enactment of laws and practices that transformed the view of slaves from personhood into thinghood. In this way, slaves could be bought and sold as chattel without presenting a challenge to the religious beliefs and social mores of the society at large. All rights were to the owner of the slave, with the slave having no rights of self-determination either to his or her own person, spouse, or children. Slaveholders began to think that slavery was grounded in the Bible. This view was inspired in part by an interpretation of the Genesis passage, "And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." Ham, son of Noah and father of Canaan, was deemed the antediluvian progenitor of the African people. Some whites used the Bible to justify the economic use of slave labor. The subjugation of slaves was taken as a natural right of the white slave owners. The second-class position of the slave was not limited to his relationship with the slave master, but was to be in relation to all whites. Slaves were considered subject to white persons. America scarcely acknowledges the existence of breeding farms, let alone documents their contribution to the early South's flourishing economy. There are self-evident truths described in the Declaration of Independence, and truths so vile that they must be concealed and ignored at all costs. The second group includes breeding farms. History books, when they mention it at all, claim that slave breeding did not begin until after the Atlantic slave trade was prohibited. In reality, it began decades earlier on plantations and farms, and it was only because America was able to produce the slaves it required that the importation of slaves from Africa was stopped. Till next time, thanks for watching.